Looking at the scriptures, one of the benefits we have by the scriptures, it reveals the mind of God. And it tells us what he wants of us, what he desires for us, what he expects from us, and what's pleasing to him. And we see that as we study this from that point of view, what does the Lord really want from me? We see that attitude has a great deal to do with what he desires in us. One of the great principles that really is at the very foundation of the divine plan is that God is striving to develop a society that serves out of the abundance of the heart. That's all attitude. His goal is to end up with a world that willingly serves him and one another. And so God is in the process of planting something in the heart of people that will drive them from their own will to serve joyfully. That's the attitude that will be common in every single individual who will eventually gain eternal life. The driving force in creating that attitude is going to be this sense of overwhelming gratitude and love that people will feel. And someday service for others will be as natural for mankind as breathing or eating. Serving God and their fellow man will be so ingrained in everyone that a day will rarely go by without a desire to do something kind and merciful and loving for someone else. Think about that. Can you imagine a world like that? Can you picture how different it's going to be for a race that's been fighting and killing each other now for some 6,000 years? And so if I had to summarize the goal of the divine plan, it would be to create a race devoted to God, united under Christ, committed to righteous principles, and dedicated to the welfare of their fellow men. Devoted, united, committed, dedicated. Those are powerful words, words that depict what God is endeavoring to do in all of our hearts. And so that goal has made the experience with sin and death absolutely necessary. And we often say God could have chosen a lot easier way to do things. And in our witnessing about the permission of evil, we say that God could have created robots programmed to follow the rules. But of course, that approach has a fatal flaw, a flaw that would have ruined God's creation. And of course, the fatal flaw is that in a universe of robots, service and obedience given out of compulsion or programming is always weak and undevoted, and it lacks the element that brings the deepest happiness and satisfaction. Robots cannot love out of an abundant heart. And so forcing man to obey is not the highest standard. It's not godlike living. God's choice, God's highest wisdom, was to make an intelligent creation in his own image. And that means that all service must come out of an overflowing heart and filled with love and appreciation. That's the image of God. And anything else would have made an inferior creation. And someday mankind's going to see the grandeur of God's approach. And they're going to accept it with their whole heart because they're going to see the awesome benefit from it. And they'll understand all the questions on why God permitted evil, that there were such important lessons for them to learn in that. But the question is, what about you and me? What about those of us who have seen the goodness of God, who want to cooperate with his plan and become what he wants us to become? Where do we fit in to God's plan of goal, of teaching us to serve out of heart abundance and appreciation? And of course, we all know the answer to that. By our consecrations, we've already said that his goal is our goal. Whatever God wants, we want. We've told him that we want to be involved in whatever he's doing. And so the work starts for you and me much earlier than it does for the world. But I think you will agree that it is so much more difficult to be a willing servant when most of society around us could care less about that. Society's motto is do for yourself, get while the getting is good, take advantage of others, move ahead. And so, brethren, if we are not careful, we can be infected by the selfishness and self-centeredness and bring that attitude into our own lives and not learn to be the servants that God is looking for. As we examine the portrait of a true servant, that spirit of willingness is one of the first qualities we see illustrated in the Scriptures. In Exodus, the 35th chapter, we read about the time that God gave the instructions for building the tabernacle. And there he makes it very clear that the free will of the people was essential for the whole system to operate correctly. This is Exodus 35, beginning at verse 4. And Moses spake unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord commanded, saying, Take ye from among you an offering unto the Lord, whosoever is of a willing heart. Let him bring it, an offering of the Lord, gold and silver and brass and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen and goat's hair. And then all the way through verse 19, Moses enumerates all the items needed for the building and the operation of the tabernacle. And then in verse 21, we read how the Israelites reacted. It says, And they came, every one whose heart stirred him up, and every one whom his spirit made willing, and they brought the Lord's offering to the work of the tabernacle of the congregation, and for all his service, and for the holy garments. And they came, both men and women, as many as were willing-hearted. And then verse 29, The children of Israel brought a willing offering unto the Lord, every man and woman whose heart made them willing to bring for all manner of work which the Lord had commanded to be made by the hand of Moses. Did you notice the prominent word in all those verses? How many times the word willing is mentioned there? Now, when we look at this, we realize that the Lord could have done all those things for them. He could have said, here's the gold, here's the silver, here's all the different kinds of cloth that you'll need to build a meeting place for me. In fact, God could have built the tabernacle for them and said, here's the building that I've created that we will meet together. But he didn't do that. He had the Israelites participating by offering their own possessions to make the tabernacle. And I think that the point that God wanted the Israelites to understand was that sometimes it costs something to serve him and to worship him. Think of that. When you donate to a particular work, that work obviously means more to you than if you just stand in the back and do nothing. Or when we labor for a special cause, that cause itself takes on more meaning for us. Or when we give in the Lord's service, that service becomes more special because we've committed something to it. What do you think would have happened had the Israelites said, I really don't want to give up that gold. It's kind of for my retirement. Or if they would have said, I was hoping to save this beautiful white linen for my daughter's wedding someday, if it ever happens. I think the Israelites who brought willingly maybe thought back to the Exodus because it wasn't that far in their past. And they probably remembered that it was God's plagues that caused the Egyptians to give them all these things. Remember, they were slaves. They had nothing. It was the Egyptians who gave them all the wonderful things that they were then able to contribute to the work of the tabernacle. In fact, the Egyptians were thrilled to give it to them just to get rid of these Jews who were bringing all these plagues on their land. And so it was God who caused all these things. It was God who gave them these possessions through his working with them. And those whose hearts were made willing discerned that it was God's goodness that got them those things to begin with. And so the more astute ones, I think, had little trouble donating those things back to the worship of God because they simply realized they were God's to begin with. And so we see that it's only when we realize that anything we have comes from God, and that any good thing we possess is the Lord's to begin with. And when you think of it that way, it's so much easier to give it back to him in his service. And in the scriptures, we see time and time again that when there is a willing heart to serve him and to sacrifice for him, the Lord always brings abundant blessings, way more blessings than the cost of the service or sacrifice we offer. After all the needed material was brought by the people, of course, the next step in building the tabernacle was choosing someone who knew how to do it, who had the skills. And we see the choosing of Bezaleel. And we're told the Lord gave him the skills to use the donated materials in constructing the tabernacle and all its furnishings. Let's read Exodus 35:31. It says, And he hath filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. And it goes on to say that Bezaleel was given the ability to work with gold and silver and brass. He was given the gift of stone cutting and wood carving. And then he was also given an assistant to work alongside of him, Aholiab, who was given the skills of engraving and embroidering. But notice that before the skills were given to them, they had to have a willing heart to serve first. That's really an important lesson for us today. Those of us who might think that we have nothing to offer the Lord, what great skill do we have? What can we possibly contribute to the work that God has? And the answer is, you do have something to offer. You've got your talents, your time, your energy, your devotion. And if you think that you have no talent to offer, remember that it was the Lord who made up what was lacking in Bezaleel after he showed a willingness to serve in any way that the Lord chose. And so the talent isn't that important. The willingness is the most important factor here. The Lord can make up the talent. He can give us an opportunity to serve that we can handle, that will be pleasing to him. Another example of the importance of a willing heart can be found in some of the last words that King David ever spoke. In 1 Chronicles, the 28th chapter, David was an old man. He knew that his life was nearing an end, and he installed his son Solomon as the next king of Israel. In verses 6 through 10, he gives Solomon his dying counsel. Now think about that for a moment. If you were an old man and you knew that your life was nearing an end and you wanted to give your son and daughter one last piece of advice, what would you say to them that would affect them in their lives? This is what David said to his son. He said, "And thou, Solomon, my son, know thou the God of thy father, and serve him with a perfect heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searcheth all hearts, and understandeth all the imaginations of the thoughts. If thou seek him, he will be found of thee. But if thou forsake him, he will cast thee off forever." Now in that verse, the thought of having a perfect heart is to have a complete heart, to have an undivided loyalty. And with that undivided loyalty to God, Solomon was admonished to have a willing mind. These are the dying words of David to his son, Solomon. Have an undivided loyalty to God and a willing mind to serve him. And you know, those are the qualities that God saw in Solomon, at least at the beginning. And so he knew that those were the qualifications that made Solomon a good choice as a king of Israel. The most important qualification for Solomon was not his intelligence or his talent. It was this. It was an undivided loyalty and a willing mind to serve God. We see that theme throughout the scriptures. It's a foundation principle of what our lives should be like. Now turning to the New Testament, of course we come upon the words of our Lord. In Matthew 20:28, Jesus said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life a ransom for many." Jesus came to serve. He came to teach us to serve. He came to show us how to serve. He just didn't give us a book and say, "Read this, you'll know what to do." He gave us a life, and he said, "Watch this, you'll know what to do." He taught us that the right motivation for service, what it should be. In essence, he said he wants us to be servants. Servants. You know, can you imagine asking a child, and I think we've probably all done this, what do you want to be when you grow up? Can you imagine any child saying, "Well, I'd like to grow up to be a servant someday"? It sounds demeaning, doesn't it? It sounds a little humbling, maybe even a little undignified to serve others. The normal human desire, I think, that we're born with when looking for what you want to be when you grow up is, what's going to be the most fulfilling? Or a kid would say, well, let's see, what's going to be the most fun? Or as you get older, maybe the more popular question is, how can I make the most money? It's usually more about what we can get out of it with our lives, how it's going to benefit us. But Jesus' answer suggested a mature Christian's goal should be, what can I give? How can I serve others? That's the ideal he shared for his true followers and for himself. It's counterintuitive to the natural fallen human nature. Motivation, having the right motive, is the key to being successful in the narrow way. And so we ask, well, what is the right biblical motivation that we should be striving for in our service? You may give the most perfect service, but if you do it with the wrong motive, it's not good. It's not acceptable. It's not pleasing. I had the opportunity of being at the Huntsville Convention a few years ago, and Brother Steve Yike gave the theme discourse based on John 13:34 and 35. It says, "There a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." And one statement that Brother Steve made that I thought was especially related to this idea of what it means to be a true servant. He said, love is defined by its actions. I thought that was profound because it brought it beyond the realm of theory. It showed us how love works in life. And then he described the practical sides of filial and agape love, which I know you all know. And he discussed how the scriptures use filial and agape love to distinguish the different levels of motivation. As you know, filial is family affection. It's a brotherly love. However, one reason that it's not the purest and the highest form of love is because filial desires its love to be returned by the one it's being expressed to. And now, desiring love to be reciprocated is not wrong. In fact, we need it. We need to have love and affection shown back to us. But agape is a higher level of love. It's the pure expression of love because it doesn't need to have love returned. It can express love without it having to be sent back. Man, that is a lot harder to do, isn't it? To love someone who doesn't love you, to serve someone who maybe never does anything for you. But that's the standard we're striving for. That's the motivation that a true servant of God should seek. Someday there's going to be a perfect mix of filial and agape love. When everyone is lifted to mental and moral perfection, there will be no love expressed that's not returned. If we learn to have agape love for everyone now, filial is going to be a piece of cake. So the best motivation for service is love. To love the brethren as family members, as well as to love them with a self-sacrificing love that doesn't need to have it returned. You know, brethren, I hope I'm not the only elder or deacon or sister or brother who's ever said, why am I doing this? Why am I putting all these hours of work into a discourse or driving to a weeknight meeting or working at a convention or preparing a meal or handling a microphone or whatever you do, or working at the dawn? Why am I doing all that? The only right scriptural answer to those questions is love for God and for the brethren and for all humanity. You should witness because you love the world and you love the Lord and you love the truth. That's the prime motivation of everything that you should do. A love that wants to serve because serving is right and good and God-like. Proper motivation is the key to acceptable service. Now, if I examine my life and I see that I never serve anyone else, it might mean that I don't really love them, because love is defined by its actions. Now, that's a very broad, sweeping statement. We don't all have the same opportunity to serve, but God knows our heart. He wants to see in us the desire, even if the opportunity is not there. He wants to see in us this servant mentality, a desire to demonstrate our love for him and for others. This is a foundation principle that should be the engine that drives all of our activities. We all can do that. We all can have a desire, even if we don't all have the same opportunities. So the portrait of a true servant has a second element. First, we saw the importance of a willing heart to serve. And now we see that the motivation for that service must be love. But of course, there are many, many more characteristics of a true servant. We're going to go to 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter. And there the Apostle Paul is in Macedonia. And he was involved in taking up a collection for the poverty-stricken brethren back in Jerusalem. And what makes this chapter so interesting is that the brethren in Macedonia were themselves very poor. He didn't go to rich people and say, I need your help for the poor in Jerusalem. He went to poor people and said, I need your help for those in Jerusalem. And you wonder, well, how can that work? How can poor people give to the other poor? But what's amazing in this whole story is that they did. The Macedonian brethren were so concerned for the welfare of the brethren in Jerusalem that they found a way. Let me read 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 5 from the Phillips translation. It says, Now, my brothers, we must tell you about the grace that God has given to the Macedonian churches. Somehow, in most difficult circumstances, their overflowing joy, and the fact of being down to the last penny themselves, produced a magnificent concern for other people. I can guarantee that they were willing to give to the limit of their means, yea, yes, and beyond their means, without the slightest urging from me or anyone else. In fact, they simply begged us to accept their gifts, and so let them share the honor of supporting their brothers in Christ. Nor was their gift, as I must confess I had expected, a mere cash payment. Instead, they made a complete dedication of themselves, first to the Lord, and then to us, because God willed it. We see some important qualities in here of what it means to be a servant. First, notice the anonymity of the givers. No individual is mentioned. Not even a specific ecclesia is mentioned. All Paul says is that the churches in Macedonia gave. And so we see that a true servant of God usually prefers to be anonymous in his service. In fact, most true servants, I think, are embarrassed when they're put in the spotlight. It's a good indication that your service is being given out of the right motive. You don't need credit for it. A true servant, I think, is just as enthusiastic when they're not even noticed. And so think about that. The next time you do something, some service, and your flesh wants a little credit for it. I think we've all had that experience. But that's not the right motive in a true servant. But in reality, everything we do is noticed by the heavenly host. Paul says that we are on a stage being observed by an innumerable company of angels. But even that shouldn't matter. If you know you're doing the right thing and this service is given out of the right motivation, it doesn't matter if anyone sees it or not. The next quality we see demonstrated by the Macedonian churches is simply their generosity. Did you notice what Paul said about them? It says, in their overflowing joy and the fact of being down to their last penny themselves, they produced a magnificent concern for other people. Overflowing joy at giving. Isn't that wonderful? Have you ever felt that? It's what you would expect out of spirit-begotten brethren. That's a godlike quality. A magnificent concern for others. That too is what God is looking for in a servant. They were willing to give to the brethren in Jerusalem while they themselves were struggling to make ends meet. That certainly indicates that their giving was genuine because it cost them something. The next quality shown by the Macedonian brethren was that one that we touched on earlier, and that they gave voluntarily. I like what Paul said, that they gave without the slightest urging. They even begged Paul to let them give gifts because they felt that it was an honor of supporting the brethren in Christ. You know, that is a remarkable attitude for brethren who are down to their last penny. And I put myself in that position. You know, if I was down to my last penny and someone comes around for a collection for poor brethren, I don't know that I would have the strength to say, well, here's my last penny, unless I saw that happening amongst the other brethren. And I knew Brother A or Sister C was down to their last penny, and yet they were reaching and giving too. Maybe by their example, I could say, well, if they could do it, I can do it. And so there's an upbuilding in the body of Christ as it sees itself, it sees others members being generous and to the point of costing them something. It's contagious. And so it's important to be with brethren who have those qualities. Giving is a greater expression of the heart when it costs something to give. It's easy to give out of your abundance. You don't feel it. You remember the lesson of the widow's mite, that she gave the last penny she had, and yet the rich Jew was giving out of his abundance. Even though he gave way more, her credit was much greater because it really cost her something. So, brethren, I think we need more Macedonian elders. We need elders who, by their example and unselfishness, serve from this overflowing joy. And I think we all need to be Macedonian Christians, copying the spirit demonstrated by those brethren so long ago. Here we are almost 2,000 years later. At least I'm marveling at their service. And we see that good examples never die, especially when they're written in the pages of the Bible. The last passage I'd like to briefly consider is a list of qualifications for elders and deacons in 1 Timothy. Now, you might think that is strange, but the qualities listed there are not just for elders and deacons. It's almost like a roll call, a definition of what the Lord is looking for in all of us. So I'd like to read verses 2 through 7, again from Phillips. It says, "For the office of bishop or overseer, a man must be of blameless reputation. He must be married to one wife only and be a man of self-control and discretion. He must be a man of disciplined life. He must be hospitable and have the gift of teaching. He must be neither intemperate nor violent, but gentle. He must not be a controversialist, nor must he be greedy for money. He must have the proper authority in his own household and be able to control and command the respect of his children. For if a man cannot rule in his own house, how can he look after a church of God? He must not be a beginner in the faith for fear of his becoming conceited and sharing the devil's downfall. He should, in addition to the above qualifications, have a good reputation with the outside world, in case his good name is attacked and he is caught by the devil that way." And I'm not going to treat all these qualifications individually. When we hold our annual election of elders and deacons, I think you probably all do what we do in Chicago. You go through this list painstakingly to see, does that brother have these qualifications? But these are qualifications, like I said, that all of us should strive for. Is it just the elders who should be hospitable? You know, my wife is way more hospitable than I am. It's a qualification that I think is more natural in the women. And so maybe the men need to work on. Maybe that's why he put it in the list of elders and deacons. He already knew the wives had it. Well, is it acceptable for those who are not elders to be controversialists or greedy for money? Of course not. What Paul is saying here is that just make sure that those you elect have these qualifications. But in reality, they are no less important in any of the Lord's people. And even the idea of being able to teach is something we should all strive for. Each of us should endeavor to explain the truth in a clear, concise way without great emotion, just logically. And you've got the truth that is the most logical and easy to explain. Because if you can explain it, it means you understand it. Well, Paul lists the qualifications for deacons in much the same way as he does for the elders. And here's another list that we all need to examine. He says deacons, similarly, should be men of serious outlook and sincere conviction. They too should be temperate and not sordidly greedy for profit. They should hold the mystery of the faith with complete sincerity. Their wives should share their serious outlook and must be women of discretion and self-control, women who can be thoroughly trusted. Deacons should be men with only one wife, able to control their children and manage their own households properly. Those who do well as deacons earn for themselves a proper standing as well as the ability to speak freely on matters of the Christian faith. Well, that's quite an interesting list. Serious about their consecrations, sincere in their convictions, not greedy, self-controlled, and trustworthy. That last quality is such an important one for servants to possess. From elders to deacons to sisters and brothers, we should be trustworthy. And not only in financial matters, that's probably one of the least important aspects of being trustworthy. We should be trustworthy with the emotions and the feelings of the brethren. Because if we are, brethren will feel more inclined to be able to speak to us about their struggles. We don't have to put on an air that we're doing it perfectly, because none of us are. If we were, we wouldn't need the blood of Christ. But if we are trustworthy with the feelings and the emotions of the brethren, there will be a unity and camaraderie between us that the brethren will feel comfortable with in talking about their struggles. And they will get our support as well as we can get their support for our struggles. And so how do we summarize the portrait of a true servant? Now, brethren, it's really the act of unselfish living. It's an art that is practiced by few and mastered by even fewer. It's difficult to have a servant's heart in a world that is dominated by selfish pursuits. But we know that in the end, God's plan is not designed for man to live selfishly or to treat others in a cold, uncaring way. And so it's important that we strive to put on those standards that God is setting forth for us and will someday set forth for the world. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 11:28 and 29. He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls." You think about the yoke that the Lord has given you to carry. I think it would be overwhelming for you if you resented carrying it. Our service for others would be a great burden if we really didn't want to carry it. But when we accept that yoke, whatever burden the Lord puts on our shoulders, when we accept it as a privilege and an honor like those Macedonian brethren did, it changes everything. Attitude and how you carry your yoke makes it not only bearable, but a joy to carry it, knowing that that is pleasing to the Lord. When we take a step back and look at this overall picture of the portrait of a servant that the scriptures draw, we see a wonderful and gratifying lifestyle. So we've seen the importance of a willing heart. We see that need to have the mentality of a servant. The motivation for our service must be love, even if our service is not reciprocated. A true servant of God does not need praise and credit for his service. A true servant is generous almost to a fault. There is humility in the heart of a true servant, and he or she treats others with a gentle touch. Patience is needed in a servant as well as self-control. A true servant is serious about their consecrations and sincere about their convictions to God and the brethren. And it almost goes without saying that a true servant is trustworthy with the feelings and emotions of the brethren. I'd like to read by closing a true story that I came across recently that I think illustrates a wonderful point and perspective from God. It goes like this. There was a young boy by the name of John Todd. He was born in the state of Vermont in the autumn of 1800. Shortly after his birth, the Todd family moved to the small village of Killingsworth, Vermont. It was there when John was only 6 years old that both his parents died. All the children had to be given to different relatives, and a kind-hearted aunt who lived 10 miles away agreed to take John, to love him, to care for him, and to give him a home. The boy lived there for some 15 years and finally left as he went on to study for the ministry. Time passed as he began and later excelled in his work as a pastor. While he was in middle life, his elderly aunt fell desperately ill. Realizing death was not far off, in great distress, she wrote to her nephew. The sad letter included some of the same questions all of us might one day ask. What will death be like? Will it mean the end of everything? Moved with compassion and overwhelmed with the memories of his youth, he wrote her these words of assurance. It is now 35 years since I, a little boy of 6, was left quite alone in the world. You sent me word that you would give me a home and be a kind mother to me. I have never forgotten the day when I made the long journey of 10 miles to your house. I can still recall my disappointment when instead of coming for me yourself, you sent your hired man, Caesar, to get me. I remember my tears and my fear As perched high on your horse and clinging tight to Caesar, I rode off to my new home. Night fell before we finished the journey, and as it grew dark, I became lonely and afraid. Do you think she will go to bed before I get there? I asked Caesar anxiously. Oh, no, he said reassuringly. She will surely stay up for you. When we get out of these woods, you will see her candle shining in the window. Soon we did ride out in the clearing, and there, sure enough, was your candle. I remember you were waiting at the door, and you put your arms around me, and that you lifted me, a tired and confused little boy, down from the horse. You had a big fire burning on the hearth and hot supper waiting for me on the stove. After supper, you took me to my new room. You heard me say my prayers, and then you sat beside me until I fell asleep. You probably realize why I'm reminding you of all this. Someday soon, God will send for you and take you to a new home. Don't fear the summons, the strange journey, or the messenger of death. God can be trusted to do as much for you as you were kind enough to do for me so many years ago. At the end of the road, you will find love and a welcome waiting for you, and you will be safe in God's care. I shall watch you and pray for you until you are out of sight, and then wait for the day when I shall make the journey myself and find you waiting at the end of the road to greet me. That lovely story reminds us of the promise in Hebrews 6:10. God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which ye have showed towards his name, and that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. And likewise, the words of Jesus, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. Brethren, may we all see clearly the portrait of a servant as painted for us by the Scriptures. And may we each commit to doing the work involved in having a servant's mentality with that spirit of joyful service, that you love serving out of an abundant heart. May the Lord help us all to that end.